Hello and welcome to the Hay Festival Book Club. I'm Shahidha Bari, Professor at the University of the Arts London and a broadcaster for the BBC. I'm hosting our discussion today, which is focusing on The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Hay Festival Book Club pick for November. Now, the novel marks its centenary this year, so it's a good year to pick it up if you haven't read it for a while, or if you've never read it at all. Copies are available for purchase on the Hay Festival website, or you can buy a copy from your local bookseller, of course, too. Now, as you may know, the Hay Festival charity is a charity with year-round activities connecting audiences with writers and artists. So thank you to everyone for their continued support and engagement, and particular thanks to the Unwin Charitable Trust, who support the Hay Festival Book Club. And if you've missed our past events, you'll find that they're available to rewatch free online too. Now, our excellent book club guides this month are Professor Sarah Churchwell and Professor Philip McGowan. Sarah is Professor of American Literature and Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Studies, University of London. Her expertise is in 20th and 21st century American literature and cultural history, especially the 1920s and 30s, and she's a frequent contributor to TV and radio, and the author of several books, including The Many Lives of Marilyn Monroe, and pertinently for us, Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby. She's also written the introduction to the Cambridge Centennial edition of The Great Gatsby. Philip is a professor in the School of Arts, English and Language at Queen's University Belfast. His research investigates the interrelation between 20th century poetry and philosophy, with special interests in F. Scott Fitzgerald, among others, and in particular Fitzgerald's short stories from the 1930s. He's also written widely on Fitzgerald's other work, including editing the Penguin US edition of The Great Gatsby too. So hello to you both.
Hiya.
Hello, good evening.
Thanks for joining us. This is going to be a lovely, pleasurable evening, I think, because Gatsby is one of those iconic books that people love and know, or they think they might know, or perhaps they think they ought to know and haven't read. So this is their chance to understand it. And it's associated with so many delicious things: flappers, gin, decadence, excellent parties, but also deception and disillusionment set against the super rich in Jazz Age New York. I'm going to start with a question that was sent to us by one of our book club members because I think it's a really good place to start. And this is from Sean. Do you remember when you both first read The Great Gatsby, and what were your first impressions? Sarah, perhaps you could go first.
Sure. Thank you. And yeah, thanks for that question. I agree. It's a really nice place to start. I think a lot of people have very clear memories of the first time they read Gatsby. It's a very memorable book for a lot of people. And I first read it like a lot of people, particularly a lot of Americans. I read it in high school, or it was basically an A-level, the equivalent of an A-level text. It's a set text.
I'm just getting my door. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's okay. I can take over. We don't need Philip. It's so I was 16 or thereabouts, 15, 16 when I first read it. And I absolutely loved it. I thought it was magical. I thought there was something about it, and I didn't know what it was. And in one sense, I've kind of spent a great deal of my Philip's doing like a comedy routine. I've spent a great deal of my professional life, in one sense, trying to answer the question to the satisfaction of my 15-year-old self of why did I love that book so much? Because I loved it without really understanding why. And I knew at the time I didn't understand why, but I found something magical about it, and I wanted to understand the magic. So in a sense, that is the right starting point for me, because it set me on this road that I've been on for a really long time.
Do you think you have figured that out now, what the magic is?
To my own satisfaction, yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it will satisfy other people. but for me, yeah. I mean, I wanted to understand how it worked. And some people think that there's a that can kill your pleasure in it, like, you know, that you take it apart and then you can't put it back together again. But for me, it's much more like being somebody who loves a watch and wants to take us apart a watch in order to understand how it works, and then puts it back together again. And the watch doesn't become less magical because I know how it works.
Yeah.
But I love feeling like I understand how the pieces go together.
Well, I hope we find out your theory of how this watch works in a minute. Philip, when did you first read it?
Well, just apologies there. My 17-year-old daughter and her 17-year-old friends are doing
Having a
something.
Gatsby
They're
expert.
studying
Yeah,
Gatsby.
yeah. Well, I first read it when I was 17, so maybe there is,
Yeah.
I was doing my A levels here in Belfast, and it was one of our choices for study. And the way we do A levels here, I don't know if it's still the same, but we went through the book laboriously slowly, and we went through every line very slowly, and then we read it again, and then we read it again. So I've been reading it for a few years now, obviously since 17. It was just so radically different to anything that we would get here in Belfast in the late 1980s. It was adventure, and it was excitement, and it was intrigue, and it was sex, and it was, oh my God, what is this book? Like, why is this happening, and who are these strange people, and and then it ends, and you're like, I need to read that again. And I think just a bit like Sarah and that idea of like the looking at the back of a watch to work out how it works. You could show me how it works all day long and how a watch works, but I still don't know how a watch shows me something that is about infinite things. And there's something about the Great Gatsby. The critic Matthew Brookely, who kind of preceded Jim West in terms of the Cambridge editions, referred to it in 1985 as inexhaustible. And I think there is something inexhaustible about this novel. You keep coming back to it, you keep finding new things in it.
We should say that you're joining us kindly in lieu of Jim, who was editing the new edition, but wasn't able to join us sadly. But we're very grateful to have you, Philip.
No, that's
Um,
okay. And
uh,
my teenage
and your
daughter.
partying teenagers, brilliant. But
Sorry.
the way you describe the book makes it sound so exciting, doesn't it? And that's what I'm thinking. Actually, that is why it appeals to 17-year-olds. That is why it's set as an A-level text, or to kind of late teenagers, isn't it? Because
Mm,
there is something that's quite magical, and that it's so engaging, actually.
yeah.
But I wonder if your readings alter with age, and as you've read it over the years, what happens to your reading over the years? Maybe Philip.
Um, I think because I find more things in it that the initial surprise and kind of revelation of the text where you think maybe it's a love story or it's about America or it's a love story to America, but then you go further into it and sometimes just like a line stands out. I remember about about 10 or so years ago being intrigued by the line that Gatsby looked like the advertisement of the man, and I went off in a whole rabbit hole about adverts and magazines and what Fitzgerald was doing with that. The thing about Fitzgerald, as you see in this book, because it is so well put together, that he was so immersed in popular culture of the time, as well as a really, really wide reader of other writers, but also of philosophers, and uh, his ability to blend so many different influences and be a cultural commentator at his time allows this book to keep bringing up new things every time you open it.
It's one of those books that has become a kind of cultural shorthand.
Hmm.
People talk about Gatsby type figures and Gatsby like parties, and they talk about American culture as though it could be somehow, or the American dream as though it's somehow kind of born with the Great Gatsby. It's an iconic novel. So what is it that makes it iconic?
Well, I mean, I have a lot of views on that question, as Philip knows. I think but there are a couple of things that I would pinpoint, especially to your point, Shahida, about readers who are maybe coming to this for the first time or for the first time in a long time. So maybe one of the things that that we can do tonight is provide some signposts for ways that at least Philip and I might navigate our way through this book. And for me, two things stand out there in terms of its iconicity. One is that its treatment by Hollywood has made it iconic. So these kind of incredible visual spectacles that people will know from either maybe the Lerman film from 12 years ago, or the Robert Redford film, which just got a lot of clipping and replaying when he just died a few weeks ago. And then there are earlier versions as well, and lots of TV versions and film adaptations. What those do is they bring the parties to life, they bring the flappers to life. Shahidha, you started with a list of kind of its iconic qualities, the gin and the flappers and the Charleston, and those are these kinds of visual shorthands that we can all picture when we picture Gatsby. Now, one of the things that's interesting though about the novel is that when you go back and look at the novel closely, and do it as many times as Philip and I have, you realize that a lot of those iconic Hollywood details are not in the novel at all. And we've actually imposed them onto the novel because we associate them with the 20s. And the novel is the iconic novel of the 20s. And therefore, we have this kind of like rule of association whereby, well, if it's iconic to the 20s, and this is an iconic novel of the 20s, well, thereby the math says that those things must be in the novel. But when you look at the novel, they're not there. So there is no Charleston in the novel. The word's not mentioned. People aren't dancing the Charleston. The novel takes place in 1922. And the Charleston was not a dance craze until about 1926. In fact, Fitzgerald had probably not seen the Charleston danced when he wrote The Great Gatsby. So it doesn't belong in the world of Gatsby, which is a novel, as I say, set in 22. The people dancing at Gatsby's party are probably dancing the shimmy. And there's a reason for saying specifically that.
Can you demonstrate the shimmy, Sarah?
I'm not going to demonstrate the shimmy for you this evening. It's not part of my professional repertoire. I'm also not I'm not dressed for it either. You wouldn't really be able to see it anyway. But the reason I say that is because the dancer who comes out in chapter 3, which is the first of Gatsby's big parties and the really glamorous one that everybody remembers, whether they know that's the one they remember, it's the one they remember. But the rumor is that she's Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. Although we are told that that is an incorrect rumor. So the erroneous rumor goes around that she's Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. Well, Gilda Gray was famous for dancing the shimmy. That's what she danced. So the girl who dances out alone and they think she's Gilda Gray or her understudy is doing the shimmy. That's what she would have been doing. That's why they would guess she was Gilda Gray. There are lots of examples like that we can do through the novel if we want to think about it in its historical moment, which is an interesting thing to do in thinking about it from the 20s, from my point of view. So first of all, we have these iconic ideas that are sometimes superimposed from the 1920s generically onto the specific world of the novel. But there's something else about the novel that does make it iconic, which is that I think that Fitzgerald writes this novel around the use of icons. He has a kind of icon, what we might call an iconic imagination or iconographic imagination, in that the symbols in the novel work on an iconic level. They're highly visual, but they have all this kind of allegorical meaning that is kind of packed into them. So if you can name details in the novel for anybody who knows the novel, and they'll remember them, and they're iconic. Dr. Eckelberg's eyes looming over the Valley of Ashes, which is also iconic. Those two go together, but they're both icons, right? Gatsby's yellow car is an icon. His house is certainly an icon. So there are these iconic details in the novel, and all of them have the symbolic meaning attached to them. And that's how Fitzgerald, one of the ways in which Fitzgerald layers up the meanings of the novel, but keeps it so brief. And as Philip was saying, it's a novel. I'm going to show here for those who don't recall how very, very slim it is. It's a novel that keeps unfolding in new ways, but part of what's so remarkable about that is that it manages to do that in such a short space of words, or span of words. And it does that partly by having this iconic technique where one word can layer in all worlds of meanings. And that goes back also to Philip's point about how we can maybe understand how the watch works, but not how it expands in these infinite ways. But I think that's partly Fitzgerald's use of icons in the novel.
Should we get into the book? I think, Philip, that you're going to give us our first reading, and you've chosen the end of chapter 1.
Yep. This is just 2 paragraphs. Already it was deep summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages, where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and, turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness.
Thank you. That I mean that is also an iconic moment, isn't it? When we that the kind of choreography where he, you know,
Hmm.
is this lonely figure at a certain moment standing at the edge of the water. We're being introduced to Gatsby for the first time here. How should we understand him, Philip? Is he a romantic hero? Is he a delusional dreamer, a criminal opportunist? What is he? How do we
He's a,
understand him?
he's a gangster. In many ways, he is a gangster, but he's a dreamer. The one of the terms that like becomes itself iconographic in this text is this the American dream. And I suppose in some ways Gatsby can be combined with senses of what an American dream might be. One of the interesting things I find about this book, though, the more times you go back to it, is that it's really Nick Carraway who's the American dreamer, who
Mm.
needs Gatsby to represent things, who needs to efface some of the skullduggery and criminal activity of Gatsby and produce this figure shimmering beside the Long Island Sound at the end of the first chapter. Gatsby. Gatsby can be anything and nothing. It depends who you are in the text and who you are as a reader. Tom Buchanan, who boo hiss, we hate Tom, but he does say at one point, that he refers to Gatsby as Mr. Nobody from Nowhere. And in some ways, he's absolutely spot on. Gatsby changes his name, he changes his identity, he has all of these stories about his past, and he is this kind of enigma figure onto whom people project many of their own ambitions, hopes, aspirations, fears. And obviously, the one we get most intel about is Carraway's version of Gatsby, which becomes in many ways our version of Gatsby.
I like this interpretation that Caraway is the great dreamer, actually. And I mean, let's talk about Nick because
Yeah.
he famously claims to be inclined to reserve all judgments,
Hmm.
but readers quickly see that perhaps this isn't as true as he claims. What's his role in this novel? Why is the story told through his perspective rather than Gatsby's or Daisy's or
Well, he's a very interesting filter. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why this novel is so very good compared to the first two Fitzgerald novels, because he gets the narrator right, he gets the tone right. In Caraway, we have this honest broker who is, very conservative. He acknowledges his conservative stock from his family. He's a very careful individual. On the first page, he refers, sort of, oh, it was terrible at college. I was referred to as a politician, but he kind of is a politician. Like he's a political reader of scenes. He can read people's characters really well. So he kind of is perfect. He's the perfect foil for Gatsby, and he's a perfect middleman simultaneously within and without, attracted and repelled. So he's kind of that a nodal figure who kind of everyone can relate to and everyone engages with but himself, he's kind of just slightly apart from it, as are we. We're at the parties on Caraway's shoulder, and we're kind of seeing everything through his eyes, and that allows just a step back, a step aside from Gatsby and from Tom and everyone else. So we are able to then figure out and think about what we think these characters are up to.
yeah, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, but I would also add that I think that it's the beginning of the novel is often tricky, especially for first time readers. It doesn't position you where you think you're going to be positioned. And Nick says these enigmatic, cryptic sort of things, and you're like, I don't know, that you feel sort of unsituated or destabilized by it. But what I would say is that it's worth noticing that Nick foregrounds two concepts or two emotions, if you like. You don't want to be so abstract, but except one's not really an emotion. But he foregrounds judgment and he foregrounds hope. And to me, that's really what the two novels are about. It's about the two novels. Those are the two ideas that shape the one novel that is The Great Gatsby. Is about the relationship between judgment and hope. And Nick is so again, to go back to the ideas that people get from Hollywood and how much I kind of want people to forget those. We can enjoy the Hollywood adaptations on their own terms, but I think that we mustn't let them shape our understanding of the novel to the extent that people tend to do. And one of the things that they do is they always depict Nick as this kind of hapless ingenue who's following them all around going, "You're so cool, I want to be your friend." And Nick in the novel is a 30-year-old veteran who's making fun of everybody. He thinks they're all ridiculous. And he is absolutely making judgments about them. But what happens is that he comes to see that there's something beautiful in Gatsby despite his absurdity. Now, that's a very different turn from, I think you're cool, oh, you might be a gangster, to you're very obviously dubious and sketchy. Wait a minute, there's something really interesting and special about you, is a very, very different turn. And to me, it's also a novel about Nick coming back to the importance of making judgments and a willingness to make judgments, which Fitzgerald can only do by having a narrator who is we're watching navigate these people and decide what the judgments are that he's making. So we enter Nick's, not just his head, but his judgment making capacity. And we follow him as he makes these judgments. But Nick is a very ironic character, which again, I think his sense of humor gets lost in the films, but it comes through in the novel if you're open to it. If you hear how facetious he is a lot of the time, how teasing he is, he's constantly mocking the other characters.
I got a sense of that. I hadn't read the novel in ages, and then I was like, oh yeah, Nick is actually, I think very early on he says that he had a dog for a few days before the dog mysteriously just disappeared.
Nick is throwing shade all of the time, but you have to be kind of alert to his tone to recognize how much shade he throws. But once you start to hear it, you can't unhear it. But also Nick is a romantic. So and that's what makes him so interesting, is he's ironic and cynical and mocking everybody. But then to Philip's point, he's also the one who needs the idealism. He's also the one who's seeking something that he can believe in again. He's the one looking for redemption as much as anybody in the novel. He wants to believe in hope again. He wants to believe in mankind again. He's lost all of that. He's become a cynic, and he's searching for some possibility that there might be something redemptive in all of this. And one of the things that I think that is so great about The Great Gatsby is that Fitzgerald doesn't give us any cheap outs there. There's no easy redemption in this novel.
Well,
there's a possibility of redemption.
Yeah. I was going to ask, is he the moral center of the novel, or is there not such a thing in this novel?
Insofar as there's a moral center, I think we would all have to agree that it's Nick. But your second question is the right one. And that becomes a very interesting question to play through. And it's something that we do when we're teaching the novel. I'm sure Philip has done it, loads of times the way I have, because it's an endlessly fascinating question. And because there is no, in my view anyway, there's no right answer. Because Nick is a fluid character and an evolving character. So he's not static. So there's no one statement about whether he's whether he's our touchstone or not our touchstone. The other way I would say this, and then I'll shut up and let Philip come in, but is that, people talk about him as a classic unreliable narrator. And the thing I remind my students of is that what that means is that sometimes he's reliable, but we don't know when. That's what makes him unreliable. Because if he were always wrong, he would be reliably wrong. He would be reliable. Right? So Tom is reliably wrong. We shouldn't trust anything that Tom says, and we should basically, anything he says, we should be like, okay, we're opposed to that. But Nick is precisely unreliable. Sometimes he's right, and sometimes he's wrong. And one of the what's the word I want? One of the paths that the novel sets us on is to try to work out alongside Nick when we think he's right and when we think he's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Nick's capacity uh, to produce in Gatsby, in the figure of Gatsby, somebody that we can look past the evil criminal activity or whatever it might be, and the sort of very dubious, sketchy past. Nick can overlook things and kind of requires that we overlook things as well. And it positions the reader in an odd place because we're not necessarily compromised, but we're led up to a certain point in the text, like in the middle of the novel. It is Nick who arranges the meeting place for Daisy and Gatsby after so many years. Now he doesn't stay there to watch what happens, and we don't see like everything. The new affair between them is off camera, so to speak. But Nick is complicit in an affair between his cousin and this whoever this guy is who lives next door. Like he's got an amazing suit and car and house and all these things, but he's kind of not looking at so much of the other stuff about Gatsby. So when you think about the moral center of the novel or morality at all in this, it really is a la carte. I'll raise a few issues about Tom Buchanan and his racism. Yes, absolutely. But these are the things, well, we might park those for now. Let's just see how Gatsby turns out.
Yeah.
At the end, he turns out all right in the end, even though he turns up dead at the end. Sorry if you've not finished reading it, anyone. But, he turns up dead at the end, even though that kind of cements his place in Gats or in Carraway's imagination as this amazing possibility for America. And he connects Gatsby to a version of America that is believable, that is hopeful. Back to that word hope that Sarah mentioned earlier. Gatsby represents hope for Carraway, who, as we know at the start of the novel, is restless after the war, and he's come east and he's from the West, and in this story of the West, after all, that he becomes disillusioned eventually again by what he sees in the East, except for Gatsby. Gatsby is the one thing to believe in. And it's a remarkable turn of events, given that, Gatsby represents everything for which I had an unaffected scorn, he
Yeah.
says at one point, declares it to the universe. And you're like, okay, do we believe you? But by the end of the novel, Gatsby is, he is everything for Carraway.
Maybe we should pick up some of this theme of hope that you've both mentioned, and maybe we could try to understand why we might want hope at this moment. I wonder, perhaps
Mm.
Sarah, you could set up some of the social and political context of this period. I know both of you have researched the 1920s extensively. What is happening in American culture and society as this book is set and written?
Yeah, so I do think I think it's fundamentally a novel about needing to rediscover hope. I think that in answering the question about the novel's relationship to hope and its moment, I would say this is one of those instances in The Great Gatsby where Fitzgerald is so far ahead of his moment, because his moment is not necessarily saying we need to find hope in America. And his moment is not necessarily saying America is losing its moral gravity and it needs to, sort itself out. But he sees that. So there are certainly indications that America is losing its way in the 20s. Look, so as I say, we've got this kind of Hollywood version again, where it's all parties and it's all gin and cocktails and, and everybody's dancing and we're all having fun, right? That very much depends on your position in American society in the 1920s. So if you are a middle-class white person, that's probably true for a few years. And by the way, that period was very, very short. Yeah. So even for those people, the boom period before that precedes the bust is at most about 5 years. Right. So it starts maybe in 22, but people don't really start to feel like they're paper billionaires or millionaires in their language until 24, 25, until Robert Gatsby comes out, and the crash happens in 29. So that is just for a very small segment of the population, right? So for people in rural areas, white and non-white, it is a very different story. For Black people, it's a completely different story. It's the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This is an era in which we have women getting the vote in the same year that prohibition is passed. And people need to understand prohibition as partly an anti-immigrant movement, which it was. It was a way to criminalize immigrant behavior for the Irish, because we need to put them in jail, obviously. Philip will understand why that. Sorry, Philip. We need to, obviously we got to jail the Irish. But it was seriously, right? It was a way to criminalize, community behaviors that were associated with the Irish, also with Italians who were coming and drinking wine, with Germans who are coming and drinking beer, and the Irish coming and drinking whiskey. So you have these older populations in America that were that were in the South, they were Baptist, in the North, they were puritanical. And so they were dry, and they saw themselves as the real Americans, and they were opposed to this new drinking culture. That's just one example, right? But there's this reactionary turn that's happening and the rise of the KKK. So on the one hand, we have all of the progressive social energy that is associated with Gatsby, women in short skirts and women drinking and smoking and partying and sexual progress, right? So you've got, reproductive, it's not reproductive rights exactly yet, but you've got access to contraception is improving, and you've got certainly conversations around reproductive rights are growing. You've got sexual autonomy. Women now have the vote. They have more financial autonomy. They're out of the war because of the changes to medicine and the war, and to education around what they called sexual hygiene. So sexual education that comes out of the war. You have just a better understanding of sexual health, and therefore of contraception and reproductive autonomy that comes through. So all of that makes it sound like this great moment for progressive values. And you got the Harlem Renaissance, you've got Black people proclaiming for the first time that they have an authentic art form and an authentic identity, and that it's positive, and that they're going to reclaim it from the racism of white people. And all of this amazing stuff is happening, but you have a reaction and a backlash to that. And you have the KKK on the rise. And I mean, not just lightly, right? You have them, by 1924, they are taking power across the country, and not just in the South, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in the Northwest, across the country. And you have prohibition as a backlash. So you've got all of these backlash movements, and you have the eugenicist nativist movement that Tom Buchanan represents, right? And that is the political energy in the novel that he represents. And a lot of readers, I think, today are sometimes they see Tom's white supremacism as being somehow out of left field, and they feel like it's kind of like, why is this guy going
like it's incidental or something?
Yeah, why is he having racist tirades? It's absolutely central to white power. White plutocratic power in 1925 talked an awful lot like it talks in 2025. It sounds an awful lot the same. And so why did Fitzgerald need to find hope in that tangle of chaos and fluid, these very rapid changes that were creating this backlash? For exactly the same reason that we do, because we are living in exactly a parallel moment, in my view, where we have very rapid social changes that are also provoking a very serious reactionary backlash. And so for people who want to believe in that possibility of progress, which is another word that we could say this novel is about. It's a novel about progress, believing in the green light in front of you. And can you make progress, or will you always be pulled back into the past? Mm-hmm. It's a novel about wanting to find hope in progress too. Anyway, I'll shut up.
No, don't. I could listen forever. I was going to let Philip add something.
Indeed.
I think that's really interesting. Just like one of the things that Sarah touched on there in terms of race. We have seen we are currently witnessing a whitewashing of history again in the United States, with the Smithsonian Museum being forced to change its exhibits and its references to how bad slavery was. This is exactly what was happening in the 1920s. The same kind of whitelash about, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, it was about states' rights, and just a repositioning reality. The correspondences between the 1920s and somehow the 2020s, this book is a kind of lens for some of those issues, because we have questions about identity, race, citizenship, politics in a kind of small p sense of the word, but also progress. Do we think that America in the 2020s is making progress towards some sort of whatever kind of future is being determined at the moment. Not so sure. There's a crossroads moment, the crossroads kind of event after World War One that the book starts from, where Caraway, I said earlier, is restless after the war and he's looking for something, and he's kind of, caught between options, the bond market or Gatsby or whatever it might be, Jordan Baker. And there's a sense of dissatisfaction. The novel ends just before the end of the novel. Caraway remembers in a kind of sense of nostalgia, which is a very dangerous emotion, potentially. And we can see that these days. He has this nostalgia about the past and about the returning trains of his youth as he's going back west and through like the Milwaukee and St. Paul Railroad and the frosted fields of the American Republic. And it's all like, oh, isn't that great? But if you look back to Fitzgerald's own life at that stage in the early 1910s and 20s, like there's as many rail crashes in the United States as successful rail journeys. Lots of people died in train crashes across the United States in the 1910s and 20s. So the book is a really interesting compilation of different kind of social and cultural movements which haven't settled or are still unsettled, let's say, in the United States. And that's what makes it really intriguing to go back to it now, to think about, well, yes, the 1920s, but look at these questions that are still live in the United States.
It's it won't surprise you that our very clever and engaged, learned audience have lots of questions about the contemporary pertinence of this book. So perhaps we can come to that in the Q&A, because I'm going to go through a few more of their questions in that section. But I wondered if we could stay for a minute with the writing, because I wanted to ask you about Fitzgerald as a prose stylist. And Sarah, I wondered if the passage is there a passage you might read that might give us a sense of what he can do, what he does do.
Yeah, what he can do, right? I mean, that's beautiful. It's perfectly put. That's it. It's at his best. I personally believe there's certainly no American stylist greater than Fitzgerald, and I would argue that there are no. He's certainly in the top English stylists of all time in terms of his ability to do things with the language that you don't expect the language to do. And I would just say to our audience as they listen to this, I'm going to slightly abridge it. This is the opening of chapter 3 as he describes Gatsby's party. So this is the famous first party, and it's incredibly glamorous, and it's a long, lovely passage, and there's no kind of obvious little bit to pull out. So I'm just going to pull out a few lines of it. But so when you go back and look at it, you'll see the stuff I cut. But I just would flag for listeners, for the audience, listen to the way that he makes language break laws of physics, because he's constantly making the language the language does things that the world doesn't do. And then I'll come back and say why I think that matters. And I have to I need my reading specs. I should have so I can peer over my specs. So I'm holding up the book, which is why I'm looking over this way. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach, while his 2 motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra has arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pitful of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are parked 5 deep in the drive, and already the halls and salons and verandas are gaudy with primary colors and hair shorn in strange new ways and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then, excited with triumph, glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. Suddenly, one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hands like Frisco, dances out alone on the canvas platform. The news goes round that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun.
Mm. Tell us about it.
So for me, and I was sort of sight reading that, so I didn't necessarily get all of the moments where he does it. But the floating cocktails, the yellow cocktail music, the blue gardens, he doesn't use realistic details. He is constantly putting together adjectives. I mean, technically, right? These are adjectives and nouns and similes in ways that are deeply surprising and pushed to the edge of surrealism. So he's almost not quite being realistic. Cocktails don't float. Cocktail music can't be yellow. But he's evoking something about a heightened, glamorous world, and he's showing that language can do something that our imagination can do, but other sorts of depictions can't do. And so, for me, one of the reasons why people have such a memorable and emotional response to this novel is that this heightened reality of its use of language in key moments of glamour and magic. That's why it feels so magical, because it is magical. He's making the language do magical things that reality doesn't do. And of course, it's a novel about Gatsby's sensitivity to the heightened possibilities of life, to the higher possibilities of romance and magic in the world. And Fitzgerald uses language in key moments to show us that heightened world and to make it come alive for us. That's what glamour is. That's where the glamour in the novel resides, is in my view, in its incredibly precise and what's the word I want? The technical control of his poetry here is unbelievable. And but it's not just virtuosity for its own sake. It all ties into the themes of the novel, and that for me is taking the back off of the watch and seeing how it ticks.
Philip.
Yeah, I would challenge, some people don't like this novel, that's fine. You don't have to. But I would challenge
we
those
might not like you.
Yeah, we may not talk to you. But I would challenge anyone really, but particularly people who like the novel, to find a spare word or sentence. Just everything, it's so tight. And if you've read previous Fitzgerald novels, This Side of Paradise, The Beautiful and Damned, yeah, could have done with an editor. A better, more stringent editor at times, I would have said. Certainly This Side of Paradise. This is not that case. Everything is there for a reason, and it plays a very significant part. As Sarah showed you, it's a small novel. It's like 47,000 words, whatever it is. It's not long. It could read it in a day. And the control and the ability, when you then begin to look at what he's doing, where he's positioning us as readers, seeing a lot of the references, whether to other writers or to historical events, and he packs it all in a seemingly casual brilliance. It's astonishingly good. That's the best literature speaks of its time. Like good literature speaks of its time, but the really good stuff also speaks to other times, like to our own contemporary moment. You can pick up the book, and it is definitely the 1920s, but it has relevance for other times, and he's able to do that, and it is genius.
Yeah. Listening to you read there, Sarah, made me see the scene, and I thought, he gives you're right that it's almost kind of hallucinogenic experience, but it's deeply visual. It's almost like directions, and perhaps that brings us to a question from Lisa. I think it's Lisa. What do you think has been the most successful adaptation of the novel? Because You mentioned the Robert Redford. You mentioned Baz Luhrmann. I can't believe that was 12 years ago now. But what do you think, the two of you? What are the most successful adaptations of this novel?
Well,
Are we going to have an argument here?
I'm going to go with 1974, Robert Redford, even though he's too
Mia
old, really.
Farrow.
And Mia Farrow, mainly because Sam Waterston is amazing as Carraway. He's the best Carraway. Tobey Maguire is Tobey Maguire, in the Baz Luhrmann.
Yes.
And the music's good. And I just bumped into somebody on outside Queens today here in Belfast, and he had watched it again last night with his family and his kids, and they loved it, and they just wanted to have a party, and I was like, yeah, okay, that's good. And they loved the music, and they loved that sort of making it contemporary.
Yeah.
One of the problems, and I'll let Sarah answer in a second, but one of the problems with this book is that the prose writing is so good that sometimes films have to, or adaptations have to, just revert to somebody reading the novel because you just can't get the words into the visuals, even though, as you said, when Sarah was reading it, we get the visuals. I'll stop.
Well, I agree with that, except that I won't even give it to the Jack Clayton 74. Because
why not?
Well, for two reasons. One is that because I'll give you an example, right? Just to follow on from exactly what Philip just said. It's such a visual novel. What Fitzgerald gives us is Myrtle in New York waiting as 5 taxis pass her by. And then she waits for a lavender taxi and she chooses a lavender taxi. In Luhrmann's New York, when the opening scene, which is a scene set of New York, it is rammed with yellow taxis. It's rammed with exactly the taxis you expect to see in New York City. Now, we can argue about the fact that that's anachronistic, which it is. But to me, what's much more important is that it stripped out all of the surprise. That is what Fitzgerald provides us with. If somebody would film it with lavender taxis, I would start to enjoy their adaptation a lot more. And that doesn't have to be historically accurate lavender taxis, although there were lavender taxis in the 1920s in New York. They could do an update. But if it's a world with purple cars, I'm paying attention. If it's a world that only has cliched yellow taxis, then I don't think you're capturing the essence of Gatsby in a way that brings it to life. So for me, there's or that does justice to it. So there's two answers to the question. In terms of the Clayton itself, Philip's heard me say this again. I'm going to say it till I die. People can put it on my epitaph and it'll be fine with me. The problem with the Clayton Gatsby, the 74 Gatsby, is that is a film in which a woman in supposedly her right mind chooses Bruce Dern over Robert Redford.
Right. Yeah.
Speaking of unrealistic, this does not happen. So, and joking aside, the story ceases to make sense. Yeah. Why doesn't she go off with Redford? He's perfect. So it doesn't work even within its own logic, and none of it really makes sense. So but to me, the real answer is, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, I've seen all of them. I've enjoyed many of them in their own ways, on their own terms. I think the 1949 black and white Alan Ladd one is hilarious, just unintentionally so, and it bears very little relationship to the book, but it's a riot, and it says a lot about America in the 1940s and 50s. But to me, there's some works of art that achieve their perfect form, and the attempt to adapt that they may inspire other works of art, and that's a wonderful thing. But to me, the best ones are where they then jump off from that point, right? So impressionist art, I might say that, a Renoir achieved its perfect form as a Renoir. The only film adaptation of a Renoir that I think is worth watching is An American in Paris, because it is doing something totally different, but jumping off of Renoir to do it and creating its own work of art out of that. But I don't think it's surpassing a version of Renoir. And that's how I feel about Gatsby. It is, in its own terms, it has found its right form, because language is what lets it do what it wants to do. And its visual strength is what tempts people into wanting to film it.
Yes, yeah.
But I feel like you're gonna have a story about silly people throwing cocktail parties.
What about the cover? This is a question from Lizzie. Let's segue into our audience questions.
The original
Lizzie asks, the book's original cover is almost as iconic as the novel itself. What's the story behind it? Did Fitzgerald like it?
Good question. Philip, do you want to take this one? Shall I take it? We can both do hours on the answer to this
I'm
question.
now looking for the original cover picture.
Have you got it in front of you?
Got it to hand. Oh yeah.
Do I have the original? Is it in your pictures in your book? Is it? I don't
Oh,
think
it should be. I would have thought so.
I'm having a quick
Jim
look
made the
here.
final decision. It must be there. Surely we put the Q-Gat in there. Although I was so,
Yeah,
yeah, there it is. We both found it in the
we
same
found it
moment.
exactly the same time. You go first.
The short answer to the question is yes, he loved it. And in fact, he wrote to his editor, Max Perkins, saying, for God's sake, don't give it to anybody else.
Yeah.
And he said that he'd written it into the book. And then there are some discussions about where, because there are two places where you could argue that he wrote it into the book. And so there's sort of fun debates about, did he mean both? Did he mean one or the other? Well, there's definitely I think not definitely, but almost certainly he at the end of chapter 5, when Nick and Jordan have a rendezvous in the city, and Jordan tells him the backstory of Daisy and Gatsby from her recollection, and they're driving around in a Victoria cab in Central Park, and then he says that he has an image of a beautiful woman's eyes over the kind of superimposed over the skyscraper of the city. And that's almost certainly one of them, but there are a couple of other places where you could argue that it might be in there. But he definitely, he thought it was great. And for the reader who is interested in this, though, I would also point you to what Hemingway says about it in A Movable Feast, which is complicated but interesting in terms of how he claims it looked to people in the 1920s, because he claims it looked trashy, which is really interesting, going back to our earlier point about iconic aspects of the novel, because the cover is now iconic. And so it's hard to get our head around. And Hemingway's, talk about unreliable narrators. Hemingway's a completely unreliable narrator, especially in A Movable Feast. But yes, so he did love it, and he thought it did what he wanted it to do.
The one of the interesting things that he wasn't so sure about was the actual title of the novel. So he kind of kept on changing his mind, Among the Ash Heaps and Millionaires, Gold-Headed Gatsby. He wanted at the very last minute to change the title from The Great Gatsby to Under the Red, White, and the Blue. But it was too late. It had already gone to print. So, The Great Gatsby, it's maybe not the best title in the world, but it's certainly the most famous of his novels.
It's certainly superior to Under the Red, White, and Blue.
Trimalchio in West Egg, was that?
Trimalchio in West Egg, that's another option.
And the High Bouncing Lover. And
he had loads of them. But he ended up, it had to be Gatsby. Great Gatsby.
This is a question from Jack. Are there any contemporary books you've read that you feel will continue to resonate well beyond our own era? So sort of what is the next Great Gatsby, as it were? That's a tough one, isn't it?
I'm a really big fan of Marilyn Robinson. I think her Gilead and Home are just two of the best things I've read in the last 20 years. If I'm thinking of American writers. But that's a left field question, Jack. I wasn't expecting that one.
No. But it's hard to think like that as well, isn't it?
It is. And I would actually, it's funny because Philip, we've never really talked about Robinson. We need to go off and do that sometime, because I'm also a huge fan of the Gilead novels, and particularly Gilead itself. But I think that it's the thing about Gatsby was, of course, they didn't see it as a masterpiece when it came out, because its brilliance could only be proven retrospectively, partly because it is a prescient novel. And so that value could only be proven once history had shown that he was right. So I suspect that their novel, and they thought it was sort of a beautifully written novel about nothing, and they couldn't really understand why he was wasting all of his talent on something so trivial. So I suspect that there's a novel out there that in 100 years people will feel that way about, but by definition we can't see it because history hasn't proven that novel right yet.
This is a question from Julie, and perhaps I'll add to it a little bit too, since we've covered a little bit of it. What do you think F. Scott Fitzgerald would make of our readings of Gatsby in 2025? And I suppose adjacent to that is, what aspects of our contemporary life might he be interested in capturing?
Oh, wow. Well, he did write to his editor not long after the publication of the novel. People didn't really know what it was about, and he's kind of still waiting for people to know what it was about. And I think we're getting there. I think some of the things that he has buried in this text, or that he is introduced into the novel we are teasing out. It has taken us quite some time. Gatsby kind of, as Sarah said, it didn't sell that well. It took a while to, heat up. And so it was basically, after the 1950s into the 60s that suddenly people are thinking, oh, well, maybe there is something in this novel. Um, what would he make of what we think of him today? I'd be intrigued. I'd be quite scared, obviously, if he turned up at one of our conferences obviously because he's dead for 60 years. But I think he would be, I think he'd be encouraged because I think some of the scholarship in the last decade or 2 decades has really begun. It's a pity Jim isn't on the call because he has done a lot of this mine groundwork and mining a lot of the versions and variations in the texts, pulling up aspects of these novels, particularly this novel, that were overlooked at the time. Where, as Sarah said, people just thought it was kind of a kind of throwaway book about parties.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, he'd be delighted that we're paying this much attention to it
Yeah.
without any question whatsoever. He knew he had done something magnificent and he was heartbroken that it wasn't appreciated.
Mm.
As Philip knows, my view is that I think it's much more than a novel about the American dream. And I think that Philip agrees with this, but that one of my takes on it is that I feel like our kind of default into just constantly saying this is the novel about the American dream, the novel about the American dream. I think he would be disappointed by that. And I agree with Philip that I think he would be heartened by the ways in which readers now are opening the text back up again beyond that one reading and seeing all the other things that he was doing in it and giving him credit for that. I think that he would be frustrated by the degree to which he's still treated as like an inspired amateur who didn't know what he was doing by a lot of people. But again, that's why I think he would like to know that there are people who are arguing against that and taking his artistry seriously and his expertise seriously, not just his genius, because, that could be something that you don't control, but his technical expertise and his control of his craft. And so I think that would be really important to him. In terms of what he would make of today, oh my word, I mean, he would be writing some really biting satires. He is certainly turning in his grave, but he also, he didn't predict Trumpism, but Gatsby imagines an America in which Trumpism is possible. Yeah. So there is a part of him that would not be surprised. It would just be horrified that for 100 years it just got worse and worse and worse, and nobody figured it out. The text where he really predicts Trumpism is not The Great Gatsby; it's his play The Vegetable, which immediately precedes The Great Gatsby, which was a huge flop and partly led to his writing of Gatsby in kind of personal and artistic ways. And that's a novel about a clown in the White House who is nepotistic and corrupt and an idiot and basically almost destroys the country and ends up impeached. And it's about how a postman would be a better. It's basically a play about how not everybody should be president. So the idea that we have this axiom that says, oh, the common man can become president, and this is a novel about how that's a really bad idea, and maybe only special people should be president.
Well, Zoe,
I mean, a play rather, not a novel, but yeah.
Although I didn't know about it, so now I'm intrigued. Zoe asks, related to this, after reading this, what should be next on our reading list? So maybe The Vegetable.
No. So The Vegetable's not a very good play.
It's not very good.
It's just it flopped for a reason. It's not an undiscovered but it's interesting. So if you are interested in what he sees in its parallels with Trumpism, but it's probably more of scholarly interest than of general reader.
If you're staying with Fitzgerald, if you don't want to do Tender as the Night, which is quite a long and difficult novel, a lot of the short stories are fantastic. Certainly from the 1930s, Diamond as Big as a Ritz. The Lost Decade is an amazing short story about a man who'd been drunk for a decade, who's an architect, and he had never seen the buildings he designed. So he's just walking around New York, literally feeling the buildings. It's amazing. It's
Babylon Revisited.
Babylon Revisited is a great one, yeah.
And also The Rich Boy, which is his first great work after The Great Gatsby, which is a long short story from 1926. I would agree. I think it's either Tender or the great short stories that kind of cluster around Gatsby and the decade or so around it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's plenty to be going away reading. Last question from Louis. Why do you think it has endured?
Ooh, we've got another hour.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was just gonna say, I hope the last hour has sort of made
Yeah.
some of our case for that.
I think because it does it has within it, and it's so well written. So that's the start. You know, it is beautiful and it's brilliantly balanced and paced. But he has so many cultural reference points that we can look to. You know, like we didn't talk about world's fairs or assassinations
Yeah.
or any of those things, but there's a lot going on in this text which is historically relevant. It isn't just totally disconnected from its times. So it's a treasure trove. It really is.
Yeah. Sarah?
I don't know that I have anything to add to that. And as I say, I feel like we sort of were making the case over the last while about why we think that is. I think that its prescience is very real. And I don't use words like prophetic or anything like that because that just sounds too sort of mystical. But because what he was a very, very close and intuitive observer of his culture. And he could see, and he could extrapolate. He could, you know what I would compare it to, actually, it's going to sound really out of left field, but it's like when Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale in 1984, she wasn't doing sci-fi. She was extrapolating from a society that she could see. And she was saying, if you keep going down this road, this is what could happen. And 40 years later, everybody's like, oh my God, it's so prophetic. She wasn't being prophetic. She was extrapolating. And Fitzgerald is doing the same thing in a totally different artistic style, a totally different métier, a totally different approach to how he does fiction. But the thinking, the intuition, and the understanding of what a society might be if it continues algorithmically, to use a modern metaphor, along the path that it's on, is, I think, partly why it's such an important book. Its artistry aside, which for us is why it's so enduring a book, but it continues to speak to people. It doesn't date because it put its finger on the heart of America, and then it broke that heart in two and said, here, you know, can you sew this back together again? And we haven't been able to do that yet.
Not such a hopeful note, but we talked about the beautiful writing, and that's something.
Well, it is. I know we're done, but I will say this just in terms of the hopeful note. It is a novel about the endurance of hope. And so I would also encourage people to go look again at the ending, which can feel only like a tragic, to Philip's point, I hope we're not spoiling it for people, but can feel only like a tragic and despairing ending. But it is a novel about the endurance of hope, the way that hope endures beyond everything. And so I actually think it is a deeply hopeful novel, and for that reason, a novel for our moment as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Sarah Churchwell and Philip McGowan, and to the Hay Festival and to all the Hay Festival team. And thank you to our wonderful audience who sent brilliant questions. I hope you enjoy reading together and discovering the things that Sarah and Philip have been talking about. The Hay Festival Winter Weekend takes place next weekend with events available to stream online. So do go explore the festival website for more. And the Hay Festival Book Club will be back again in the new year with some exciting updates. Watch this space. So goodbye from us for now and happy reading.